So there are a few ways that the delivery of gene therapies affects the choice of diseases that we go after, as well as the type of approach that we would use to do that. So, for example, um, for most of my career, there were a lot of viruses that were being considered for gene therapy applications. But by now, those have kind of coalesced into three major viruses. One of those is adenovirus, which is not widely used anymore, but still has a lot of potential as a gene therapy vector. Lentiviruses, which is something that's used in dividing cells and a lot of ex vivo gene therapy that I'll talk about in a second. And then there's the adeno-associated virus, which is kind of becoming the go-to virus for delivering gene therapies in vivo. And that's because the AAV virus is one of the best things that we know of today to get into cells in a very highly efficient way. So they can be injected into the brain, they can be injected into other organs in the body, they can be injected into the blood, and they're very good at going and transducing the cells and delivering the gene therapy like that. Um, Now, what I'm describing with viral vectors is what we call in vivo delivery. So that means that we're going to take some kind of gene therapy and deliver it into a person. An even simpler way to do gene therapy would be if you could take cells from a person, uh, do the gene adding in a culture dish, and then reintroduce them into a person. So that's called ex vivo gene therapy because we take the cells out, we treat them in a dish, and then we put them back in. So you could imagine that with ex vivo gene therapy, you have a lot more control over the conditions and how you would put those viruses into the cells, and then you put the cells back in. So it's not surprising that some of the very early uh, cell and gene therapies are using the so-called ex vivo technique. But the first gene therapy that was approved in Europe, Glybera, was an AAV in vivo gene therapy. It treated a very rare disease called uh, uh, lipoprotein lipase deficiency, uh, which is a very rare disease. And that was a case where they were able to inject the protein into a muscle, and it was able to circulate in the blood and do its job. So that was a very good one for AAV. The first approved gene therapy in the United States was Luxturna, and that was another AAV therapy that was delivered directly into the eye. There, the eye has an advantage because it's kind of protected from the immune response. Um, and some of the subsequent gene therapies have used this ex vivo gene therapy approach, and a very popular example of that is CAR T therapy, which is an anti-cancer therapy that is done ex vivo. So all of these kinds of approaches are being used in gene therapy now, but there are some limitations, and we can hear more about those limitations in the next talk.
So in terms of eligibility criteria, they fall into two main buckets. On the one hand, the first bucket would be more about the science and the mechanism of the gene therapy itself. And the second bucket has more to do with our healthcare system in terms of how these drugs get prescribed and accessed and reimbursed. Going back to that first category of science, of the scientific types of issues, in the case of AAV, which is the most frequent form of gene therapy that's being developed right now, there is a limitation to the size of the payload that that particular type of gene can package. And how that impacts patients' accessibility means if you're having a disease that needs to be treated with a gene that is too big to fit into an AAV, that means that in many, many instances, that drug literally cannot be created, at least using that type of technology, which is such a common technology right now. So there's going to be certain diseases that are linked to certain genes that simply will not fit into the AAV construct. And then secondly, because AAV is a virus, it does provoke an immune response. There is a certain percentage of the population that has a pre-existing exposure to AAV, and they already have an existing certain load of neutralizing or total antibodies. And in the case of a variety of AAV products, there's going to be a cutoff above which patients are not going to be eligible to get drug because they simply have too many neutralizing antibodies. And even in that case, when they do meet the cutoff, that means that they're going to have to be exposed to some type of form of immunosuppression or immunomodulation, which is part of the protocol of many, many AAV drugs right now. That being said, even once you qualify, you meet the correct cutoff, you get the appropriate immunomodulating therapy during the time of your treatment and a little bit after as well, your body still does initiate an immune response. So after the treatment has been administered, these patients now are walking around, hopefully with an improved disease state. However, they've also significantly increased their antibody load, and that essentially precludes them from getting another AAV product in most cases. So again, there's certain changes that AAV does to the immune system that are not reversible. In terms of the healthcare system issues that can impact patient access, we know that when we develop drugs, whether they're gene therapy drugs or other drugs, it's by means of clinical trials where there's certain patients that are included, certain patients that are excluded. Based on that, the data get generated. Based on that, the sponsor is ideally able to show the agency, whether it's FDA or another country, adequate efficacy and safety, that then that drug gets approved because from the regulatory perspective, it's an appropriately safe and efficacious drug. Then the drug gets launched and commercialized in the real world. And the issue that some and unfortunately too many patients can encounter is that although they have the disease or the diagnosis for which this drug has been labeled, they might not exactly meet the inclusion criteria that were applied for when this drug was developed. In other words, a very easy example might be if a patient population that was included in the drug development, whether it was phase 1, 2, 3, was up until ages, say 65, there could be justification on the part of the insurance providers or the payers to say, well, there's really no data to show that this drug is efficacious in a 75 or 85-year-old person because all the data that had been generated that brought this drug to market was being performed in patients that fall within a different age group. So suddenly that can be a barrier to access where the patient who's sitting in front of the physician who's getting the drug prescribed to them does not technically fit the criteria that are in the label. And in some cases, payers use that as a rationale to deny access to patients. So that is why it is very, very important that as drugs get developed and as they get approved and post-approval, we continue to gather as much real-world data as possible, feed that back into the system, and that's a really nice means of ultimately further developing a path that will expand access to patients.
So there are actually lots of lessons that we can learn in the gene therapy approvals for hematologic diseases such as sickle cell from what we already know about CAR T cells. And I think this is really important, and we're fortunate in that it's 2024. We've had approved therapies, gene and cell therapies for hematologic malignancies like leukemia and lymphoma. since 2017. So this has allowed us some time as providers, as social workers, as patient navigators, and even as patients or family members to understand some of the complexities of these therapies. So number one, I think we all recognize that these therapies can be quite costly. And part of the reason that it's important to recognize that is that these are not costs that people are typically able to assume on their own. They're costs that are usually going to go to an insurance company. So it's important to think about the patient population. So if we think about most patients with sickle cell, there certainly are a significant proportion of patients, even up to 50%, who are on public insurance, such as Medicaid. And so this is really important because these are high cost therapies and they're designed differently than the way we typically think about other therapies. They're designed to potentially be curative, to be one-time treatments. And so as we grapple with that, not only as medical professionals and patients and families and caregivers, we have to also think about how, from a public health standpoint, we grapple with that and how we navigate these insurance issues. I think all of us, regardless of what sort of insurance we may have, recognize that it is almost like speaking a different language when you're trying to understand what benefits you have, when you're trying to understand how to get things approved. And these therapies, in their complexity and in their goal to be a one-time treatment potentially and to kind of eliminate in a lot of ways some of the other therapies that patients may need, it really shines a light on the fact that we have to recognize that systems have to have a way in place to address the fact that they're pretty high cost. So one thing we've learned from CAR T-cell therapies is that when you're looking at a therapy that could potentially replace other chemotherapies, bone marrow transplant, et cetera, the way that it is explained to a patient and family has to be a little different. The way that we think about it when we seek insurance approval has to be a little bit different. The way that we think about it when we think about long-term care has to be a little bit different. And I think one thing that's become very clear is that individual hospital systems have to work with insurers, have to work with these companies to understand how we can provide this therapy in a way that works for patients. Fortunately, there are mechanisms to address the fact that these are really high costs and address the fact that we want these potentially curative therapies to be available to people that need them. It's a huge equity and access issue. And fortunately, in the United States, there are actually plans that are rolling out looking at specifically access models and how these therapies will come to fruition. So I think the advice that I would give to patients seeking this therapy, you often already have a specialist who is taking care of your underlying illness, and they often have helped navigate you through some of the tricky clinical decision making, through some of the treatments. And it's important to recognize that providers and hospital systems typically understand that this is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be complex. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking trying to understand how you will navigate the insurance aspects of this. But most hospitals and systems are actually working through streamlined processes that will take some of that burden off of the patient, but also work with insurers, work with programs such as the CGT, the Cell and Gene Therapy Access Model, to see how we can get these therapies to patients. We've also learned a lot about the patient populations that we're working with. And as someone who works in the cell and gene therapy field and is accustomed to helping patients navigate through these therapies that work differently than a regular, medicine that you pull off the shelf, or through even other medicines you may take by mouth. They work differently. They involve literally taking blood from patients and genetically modifying those blood cells and then giving them back to patients. Because of that, people can often make assumptions about patients' willingness to receive these sorts of therapies. It's really important for us to remember that every patient who's potentially eligible to benefit from these therapies should have the opportunity to fully hear about them, to understand them, and that barriers related to financial barriers, barriers related to geographic barriers, barriers related to what type of insurance you have should not be barriers that make us say, this isn't going to be a therapy that is feasible for this patient. They should be barriers that make us say, because we know these are high cost therapies, because we know that these therapies are quite complex, we need to use what we've learned from similar therapies, such as CAR T cells, and look at the streamlined processes we put in place and anticipate things that we can do together to make sure that these therapies are more accessible. I encourage patients and patient advocates, whether that be a caregiver of a patient, whether it be someone who's working in a patient navigator position, through a society, anyone who is involved with a patient, I encourage them to ask. Talk to your providers, talk to your care team, say, hey, I heard about this approval. Is this something that I would be eligible for? Do you think that this is a therapy that we should consider for me? What issues do you anticipate, knowing what you know about my history as my provider? And how should we think about this? Is this a game changer? Will this be accessible to me? Will we have it available at my treatment center? If not, but there's still potential benefit, what are some mechanisms we have to help me receive this therapy at an outside institution? This is really important. We will get it figured out. We got it figured out for CAR T cells, and we learned so much. And one of the really important things to remember is the same experts who were involved in ensuring that we have access to CAR T cells for patients that need them are often involved in ensuring that patients with sickle cell disease who could potentially benefit from these gene therapy approvals have access to them as well. So the future is bright in this area. I think that the timing of these approvals is really quite remarkable because we've had time to learn best practices related to implementing CAR T cells. We've learned that at the beginning, there may be limited sites. We've also learned that that's not necessarily acceptable, that the goal would be to ensure that these therapies are available throughout the United States so that people don't necessarily have to travel across the country to receive them. We've learned that we have to really be attentive to follow-up. We've learned that our mechanism of follow-up for these patients may be different than traditional therapies. We've learned to listen to patients and their families and to social workers. We've learned that when the system is not necessarily equipped to handle the burden of certain things, that we have to take a step back and look at changes that we can make to the system. So the future is bright. I'm excited that we have these therapies. I'm excited that we have learned so much from CAR T cells so that we don't have to start at the very beginning and trying to ensure that patients that can benefit from these therapies have them. And I'm really looking forward to seeing these therapies truly be life-changing for a number of patients.
Hello, hi, I'm Dr. Andrew Campbell, Director of the Comprehensive Sickle Cell Disease Program at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. While I think providers might be aware that CGTs or these new treatments are available, many are not aware of the process of getting cell gene therapies to their patients. Outside of the major academic hospital centers that have the capabilities of offering CGTs, many physicians don't know where to start to initiate referrals for these transformative treatments. Many insurance plans, including Medicare, Medicaid, MCOs, may not have considered how they will make these commonly but expensive CGTs available to patients that they serve, especially if they've been recently FDA approved. Additional systemic barriers for our patients who need these therapies are patients who live in states where the only access to these therapies are neighboring state who may not accept their insurance. So this becomes a significant barrier for patients living in more rural areas of the country. So patients with rare diseases such as sickle cell disease have providers who have limited knowledge of accessing these gene therapies, cellular gene therapies. So advocacy is so important. And it can start with providers. And it can start at your hospital, for example, asking the important key stakeholders within your hospitals to make this treatment available, especially if the resources are available at the hospital, at your hospital. Many hospitals will still have resources, but will not act on providing these transformative CGTs to patients who are eligible, especially if they're FDA approved. Also, advocacy at the government level, at the legislative level is also important within your state because it's so important to get legislative representatives to listen to patients and families to hear their stories of why these treatments can be life-changing treatments for themselves or for their children. There are many reasons why families are excited about gene and cell therapies, especially in patients with sickle cell disease. These are patients who I care for. In sickle cell disease, there are disease-modifying therapies that you have to take on a daily basis or on a monthly basis in infusions. That includes Adafio that gets in infusions once a month, blood transfusions, get that once a month. And the other ones, hydroxyurea, Endari, and Oxbryta are all meds you take every day. But unfortunately for sickle cell disease patients, as they age, many of these disease-modifying therapies, including hydroxyurea, may not be enough to really lead to a better quality of life when they become an adult patient. So from the perspective of a pediatric patient, a lot of our parents and our families and our patients look at this as a gateway to a better quality of life, where these gene therapies can allow them not to take their medications every day. It allows the stem cells with the gene therapy product to do the work for them as they're just walking. They let the stem cells do the work for them. They don't have to take medications. I don't have to get blood transfusions. That's related to their sickle cell disease and preventing those complications. It allows them to do more things that they usually wouldn't do, such as quality of life, swimming, skiing, but more importantly, hanging out with their friends, for example, and not worrying about getting a sickle cell crisis. Allowing them to get a job and working without disruption, allowing them to not worry about when the next unanticipated painful episode that might happen for their sickle cell disease. Allows the family, the caretakers to go back to their jobs and not have as much interruptions in their daily lives. Allows families to connect to each other more in a more healthier way. So the future for our families with sickle cell disease, for example, are bright. And the other thing is, what's exciting about these therapies is that it's durable so far. A lot of our families have echoed to us that durability is so important to them. And they don't have to worry about their child taking their medication every day. And they know that the stem cells with the gene therapy product will be doing that for them. And then the last thing is prevention of in-organ damage. So if you are getting significant complication from sickle cell disease, for example, this transformative cell gene therapy can really change the life trajectory of a patient with sickle cell disease, for example, where they will not get ongoing organ damage, hospitalizations, ED visits over time. So it really, really improves the quality of life. And it's not for everyone. We know that some families may not want it, but what's very clear is that a lot of our families would like to have the right and to have access to an FDA-approved drug that can be significantly transformative in their child's life.